Since you mentioned anti-Semitism, I want to touch upon really the exploding levels of anti-Semitism in Britain. Correct me if I'm wrong, but largely driven by both skepticism toward Israel, but also the importation of mass levels of migrants from parts of the world who are traditionally anti-Israel, Middle East and North Africa. And I want to look at this chart on the screen, which says that especially after October 7th, there has been a rampant levels of anti-Semitism in the UK, as in the rest of Europe, to be fair. It's just funny to me, or sad rather, than following the largest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, there is an explosion of anti-Semitism accusing Israel of sort of doing it to itself, and sort of all those conspiracy theories, but also all those pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas demonstrations in the streets of London and other British cities. Over 3,500 anti-Semitic incidents reported in 2025 alone. And I'm interested mostly not just in the trees, but in the forest, rather, as in we tend to think of those as incidents and that they come and go. But then there is a larger trend that in general, the United Kingdom, sadly, is increasingly becoming unlivable for Jewish communities, or being harassed, or being ostracized, or just marginalized, and but really being threatened by theirs. Islamic communities who are growing larger and larger in the United Kingdom.
So I would say the really telling element of those for me was that the very first pro-Gaza march occurred after October 7th, but before Israel had struck back. So they were protesting something that hadn't happened yet. They were protesting when the only bodies cooling on the floor were Jews who'd been murdered by Hamas and by Palestinians. That was indicative that, it didn't matter what the facts on the ground were. It was just a pure identity-based thing. We will back our guys. And you see it a lot. They'll say, oh, we obviously think that the murder is bad, et cetera, but no, I'm not going to, say these things specifically are bad. And I'm going to argue around the edges about, did that really happen, or how many people were killed? Very recently we saw someone who's now working with the Green Party, who apparently has been saying that there were no rapes that occurred on October 7th. Levels of denialism. And that's from someone who's not Muslim. That's someone who's a white progressive liberal. So what you're seeing on anti-Semitism is basically a horrible combination of the far left and, some radical Islamic views. Going back to the culture transplant, there are a lot of Muslim countries have very strong anti-Jewish views. And when you bring those people over here, they bring those views with them, or some of them bring those views with them, which is pretty much what you'd expect. But the result has been that increasing mass migration from those countries has meant more anti-Jewish hate. At the same time, there's been a sort of rise in the far left, particularly identification of Israel as being somehow a colonialist power. So you can bring in the anti-imperialist thing, somehow being a white supremacist power. I'm not quite sure how that works, but somehow in their heads it does, which means that they can sort of bring all their prejudice against white people into it. And just sort of, combining these together into a very unholy mix that basically is, we don't like Israel because there is a level of violence that we don't like. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of states committing various levels of violence, many of them with a great deal less accuracy and care than Israel. The reason why they're picking on Israel is because Israel is a functioning Western state, and they don't like that. Something in that instinctively makes them angry. In the same way that when we had the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a lot of racial prejudice around the world, and no one would say that Western societies don't have some form of racial prejudice, or that doesn't happen. But Western societies are by far the most tolerant ones in the world, and also the ones that are probably the most excised about this. So why was the attention so internally focused? And the answer is because of a large amount of self-hatred. That's what's motivating these people.
And I would argue not just self-hatred toward a strong Western democracy, but because it is the nation state of the Jewish people, and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have been sadly blending one into the other for the past few years in a really shocking way. Don't miss a moment. Hit the subscribe button right now and be the first to watch the next episode.